The ocean seemed calm, too calm, when Daniel's kayak suddenly fractured beneath him, splitting open with a sharp crack that tore through the night. One moment he was gliding smoothly across the pitch-black Atlantic, guided only by a thin sliver of moonlight. The next, icy water surged into the kayak like a living creature, dragging him under with terrifying force. He fought his way back to the surface, gasping, spinning, disoriented. The kayak was gone, swallowed by the waves as if it had never existed. Above him, clouds rolled in thick and fast, smothering the moon, plunging everything into a suffocating darkness. No horizon, no shoreline, no lights, no help. And as the realization settled in, sharp and unforgiving, Daniel understood the weight of his mistake. Nobody knew he had gone out to sea that night. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. His frozen fingers brushed against something solid, a battered piece of driftwood, rough and waterlogged, but large enough to keep him afloat. He clung to it desperately, wrapping his arms around it as if it were the last piece of the world still holding on to him. And if you're watching this right now, take a moment to support this story. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment your country and city. Let us know where you're watching from. Because the decisions Daniel made next, blind in the dark and trembling in the cold, shaped the difference between life and death. This wasn't just survival. It was a brutal fight against fear, against the unknown, against a night that seemed determined to erase him. Time stretched into something unrecognizable as waves battered him relentlessly. Hypothermia clawed its way up his limbs, stiffening his muscles, slowing his heartbeat. Then something smooth brushed against his leg beneath the water. He froze. Another slow glide followed. Deliberate, heavy, alive. Something out there was circling him. He tried to pull his legs onto the driftwood, but the narrow plank kept tipping, and his frozen body barely obeyed. Every faint splash felt like a threat. Every ripple sounded like a warning whispered from the deep. The darkness wasn't empty. It was watching. Memories surfaced in flashes. His mother calling him home, his father teaching him how to bait a hook, his younger brother running barefoot across the sand. Then his father's old lesson echoed through his mind with a painful clarity. The ocean doesn't hate you, son. It simply doesn't care. And now, wrapped in darkness and cold, Daniel felt the brutal truth of those words. His body trembled uncontrollably, his thoughts slipping into fog as the cold burrowed deeper. Yet some stubborn spark inside him refused to let go of the driftwood. Whether it was instinct, faith, or sheer will, it held him anchored to life, if only barely. Then it came, a faint metallic clang echoing across the water. Daniel jerked his head up, heart surging with sudden hope. A boat, a chance, a miracle. But the sound didn't grow louder. It drifted away, swallowed by distance and wind. Panic exploded inside him. He tried to shout, but his voice cracked and vanished into the waves. A wall of water crashed over him, forcing him under, filling his mouth with salt. When he surfaced, coughing and half-blind, a cold truth settled over him. Surviving the kayak sinking wasn't the challenge. It was just the beginning. What waited for him over the next 48 hours would test the limits of what a human being can endure. Long before the night his kayak vanished into the Atlantic, Daniel had always found comfort in the sea. It was where he went to clear his mind, to breathe, to feel small in a way that reminded him life was bigger than his worries. He grew up on the coast, spending countless hours watching fishing boats drift along the horizon. The ocean's rhythm had been the soundtrack of his childhood. Waves breaking, gulls crying, wind rustling against weathered docks. But the irony of that comfort was cruel. The very place he trusted most would become the setting of the most desperate struggle of his life. What happened to him that night was not fate or punishment. It was a collision between human vulnerability and nature's indifference. And it began with a simple decision that spiraled into a nightmare. Daniel wasn't reckless. He was experienced, familiar with the tides and seasonal winds. But he was also confident. maybe too confident, and that confidence pushed him to paddle out later than usual. He wanted the quiet, the stillness, the chance to watch the stars reflect on the water before heading home. It was supposed to be peaceful, almost therapeutic. He checked the weather, packed his gear, and sent a quick message to his brother saying he'd be home soon. But soon stretched into something else when the wind shifted and the clouds rolled in faster than predicted. By the time Daniel noticed the change, he was already too far from shore, enveloped by a darkening sky that swallowed the horizon. The sinking of the kayak wasn't the beginning of his fear, it was the confirmation of it. Hours earlier, he had felt a subtle unease ripple through him as the waves grew heavier and the temperature dropped. He dismissed it, attributing it to nerves or fatigue. But deep down, he knew the ocean was shifting. He just didn't realize how drastically. When the hull finally cracked open beneath him, it felt almost symbolic, as if the sea was reminding him that strength and control were illusions. The shock of the cold water, the violent pull downward, the darkness closing around him. These were moments that etched themselves into his memory with painful clarity. Once he surfaced, gripping the driftwood that would become his fragile lifeline, Daniel faced a reality few people ever encounter. Absolute isolation. No lights in the distance, no sound of engines, no other human being. The world around him was reduced to darkness, water, and the pounding of his own heart. He had no way of knowing how far he had drifted or whether he was being pulled farther out to sea. His mind raced, cycling between hope and terror, between calculation and panic. Survival wasn't about finding a solution, it was about resisting the instinct to give up. In that vast emptiness, even hope felt fragile. Yet amid the fear, something else took root inside him. Determination. Not the dramatic, heroic kind portrayed in movies, but a quiet, stubborn resolve that grew stronger each time the waves tried to pull the driftwood from his grip. He didn't know what he would face over the next hours. Hunger, cold, exhaustion, hallucinations, the unknown creatures beneath him. But Daniel understood one truth. As long as he held onto that piece of wood, he still had a chance. And sometimes a chance, even the smallest one, is enough to start a fight for survival. What lay ahead would test every ounce of his endurance, every memory that kept him anchored, and every silent prayer he whispered into the dark. The first hour after Daniel's kayak sank was a blur of shock and instinct, a frantic battle between his trembling body and the freezing Atlantic that surrounded him. His mind kept replaying the moment the hull split open, the violent snap, the sudden collapse beneath him, the rush of icy darkness swallowing his legs. Every time the image flashed in his mind, his chest tightened, as if the ocean was still pulling him downward. The driftwood he clung to felt rough and heavy, but it was the only solid thing left in a world that had dissolved into darkness and water. The cold gnawed at him, sinking deeper into his muscles with each passing minute. His breaths came fast and unsteady, fogging his senses and making it harder to think clearly. Shock was a silent predator, creeping into his thoughts, making every decision feel slower, heavier, almost distant. Daniel tried to orient himself, but the night had erased every reference point. He turned his head left, then right, searching for a flicker of light, maybe from a distant boat, a lighthouse, or even a home along the shoreline. But the darkness was complete, thick as ink, swallowing everything beyond arm's reach. The only sound was the relentless rhythm of the waves crashing against the driftwood and his own ragged breathing. He considered trying to swim toward what he thought might be land, but the cold had already stiffened his limbs, draining his strength faster than panic could motivate him. Swimming blindly in freezing water wasn't courage. It was suicide. So he clung to the driftwood, forcing himself to stay still, to conserve whatever warmth his body still had. His father had once told him that cold water kills faster than hunger, faster than exhaustion, faster than most predators. Tonight, Daniel felt the truth of those words in his bones. Fatigue settled over him with a weight he hadn't expected so soon. His body shook violently, waves of shivers rolling through him so intensely that his teeth chattered in painful bursts. He pressed his cheek against the wood, trying to steady himself, but the trembling wouldn't stop. Hypothermia had begun its slow invasion, creeping from his fingertips into his arms and chest. He felt it like a shadow spreading through him, one that threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. He tried to focus on his breathing, slow, steady, controlled, but the cold made every breath feel shallow and desperate. For the first time since the accident, Daniel wondered if he would actually survive the night. Not the next day, not the next 48 hours, just the night. Then came a sound that snapped his attention into focus. A splash, not a wave, not his own movement. Something else, something alive. Daniel stiffened, tightening his grip on the driftwood as he listened. Another splash followed, closer this time, cutting through the wind with an eerie clarity. The darkness around him suddenly felt thicker, alive, almost breathing. He searched the water with frantic eyes, but he saw nothing. Only the faint outlines of waves rising and falling. Then something brushed against his leg, soft and smooth, gliding through the water with unsettling ease. Daniel's heart lurched into his throat. His entire body went still as fear wrapped around him like a vice. He pulled his legs up instinctively, but his numb muscles barely obeyed. He whispered into the darkness, a tremor in his voice. "Please, don't." But the ocean offered no reply. The creature didn't strike. It didn't bite. It simply passed beneath him, its presence felt but unseen. Yet its silence made everything worse. Daniel imagined sharks, rays, large fish, anything that could be drawn to movement or the scent of fear. The uncertainty clawed at his mind, making the darkness feel endless and hostile. For minutes, maybe longer, he stayed frozen, barely breathing, waiting for another touch, another pass. When none came, he felt a sliver of relief, but it was thin and fragile. The ocean wasn't empty. It wasn't harmless. It watched. It waited. It moved around him with a quiet intelligence he couldn't understand. The realization chilled him in a way the cold water never could. As time stretched forward, Daniel's thoughts began drifting to the life he had left behind just a few hours earlier. The warmth of his home, the kitchen light left on by his mother, the message he had sent to his brother. Be back soon. How long would it take before they realized he hadn't returned? Would they think he stayed out late? Would they assume he fell asleep at a friend's house? Hours might pass. A day. Maybe more. The ocean current tugged at him gently, reminding him that time didn't belong to him anymore. Out here, hours were measured in shivers, breaths, and the strength of his grip on the driftwood. He wondered if his family would eventually search for him, or if his absence would blend into the late-night quiet of their home before panic finally set in. The wind picked up, slicing across the water with sharp, icy gusts that whipped at Daniel's soaked clothing. Each gust made him shiver harder, stealing the little warmth he had left. He tried adjusting his position on the driftwood to keep more of his torso out of the water, but the plank threatened to roll every time he shifted. He had to choose, stay partly submerged and shiver, or risk flipping the wood and losing everything. He chose the cold. He had no other choice. As the waves rose and fell, the motion made him nauseous, dizzy, and exhausted. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the darkness, but the images of what could be beneath him filled his mind until he snapped them open again. Eventually, Daniel forced himself to think logically, something he had done countless times while fishing, hiking, or navigating dangerous terrain. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. He needed to stay alert. He mentally listed everything he knew. He was drifting. He was alone. The night was long. The water was cold enough to kill him if he lost focus. That meant staying awake wasn't an option. It was a necessity. He needed to keep moving slightly, just enough to generate warmth, but not enough to exhaust himself. He needed to keep his mind active, to push away the creeping numbness that invited sleep. He talked to himself softly, whispering reminders. Stay awake. Stay with it. Don't drift off. Don't let go. Somewhere in the distance, faint and distorted by wind, Daniel heard a sound, something rhythmic, metallic, almost mechanical. His heart leapt. A boat, a buoy, anything that meant human presence. He lifted his head, listening with every fiber of his being. The sound came again and again, but it was faint, impossibly faint, as if drifting farther with each passing second. He tried to shout, but the cold had weakened his voice. The call that escaped his lips was thin, strained, swallowed by the wind before it traveled more than a few feet. He tried again, louder this time, but a wave slapped against his face, choking him with salt water. When the metallic sound finally faded into nothing, Daniel felt something inside him crack, hope slipping just out of reach. By the time the sky shifted into the faintest hint of dawn, more of a gray breath than a color, Daniel had survived the most dangerous hours of the night. His body trembled violently, his lips were numb, his fingers felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. But he was alive, exhausted, terrified, nearly frozen, but alive. As the horizon slowly brightened, he could finally see the faint outline of the waves around him, stretching into forever. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't beautiful. It was overwhelming, endless, indifferent. And yet, that small shift of light meant something he desperately needed. The night was over, one battle finished, countless more ahead. As the first traces of morning light spread across the horizon, Daniel blinked through the numbness clouding his vision. Dawn did not bring warmth or comfort, only clarity. The vastness of the ocean revealed itself in shades of gray and blue, stretching into infinity in every direction. There was no land, no boats, no signs of life beyond the restless rise and fall of the waves. The world felt enormous, and he felt impossibly small, a single human suspended between sky and sea. The driftwood beneath him looked even more battered in the daylight, its edges splintered and uneven. But it floated, and for now, that was enough. Daniel's muscles ached from hours of shivering, and every breath felt sharp, as if the cold had scraped his lungs raw. When he flexed his fingers, they barely responded. He had survived the night, but the day would demand a different kind of endurance, one that tested his body in ways he wasn't prepared for. The sun began to rise higher, casting a pale warmth across the surface of the water. It helped a little, but not enough. Daniel's clothes were soaked through, and every drop of water on his skin acted like ice clinging to him. He tried to wring out his shirt, but the moment he loosened his grip on the driftwood, the plank wobbled dangerously. He grabbed it again, his heart racing. Even a small slip could drown him. So he pressed his chest against the wood, staying as still as possible, letting the sun dry him slowly. It was agonizing. His body craved movement, craved heat, but movement risked everything. Hours stretched endlessly. The sun climbed, his strength dwindled, and the exhaustion that had gnawed at him through the night grew sharper under the new weight of hunger and dehydration. By mid-morning, Daniel's lips had cracked and his tongue felt like sandpaper. He hadn't swallowed anything since the previous evening, and the salt water splashing into his mouth made the thirst unbearable. His stomach cramped, twisting painfully. Hunger was nothing new to him. He had gone long days on hikes with little food, but this was different. This was hunger mixed with cold, fear, and helplessness. He scanned the water for anything, seaweed, debris, even a fish he might attempt to grab. But there was nothing. The ocean offered no gifts, no easy solutions. The waves rolled calmly now, mocking him with their steady rhythm. Daniel began to understand that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about accepting the brutality of waiting. As the sun climbed higher, fatigue washed over him with new force. The light made him squint, sharpening the headache that had begun hours earlier. His eyelids grew heavy, and for a moment he felt them droop, the weight of sleep pulling at him like gravity. The thought terrified him more than anything so far. If he fell asleep, if he let go, he would slip into the water without even noticing. He forced his eyes open, lifting his head and whispering to himself, Stay awake. Stay awake. He needed to do something to keep his mind active. He counted the waves. He repeated his family's names. He listed childhood memories. Anything to hold on to consciousness. The ocean, vast and quiet, seemed to whisper in return, urging him to rest, to let go. He couldn't listen. Around midday, something changed. The waves grew taller, rolling under him with more force. The wind picked up, chilling his already fragile body. Daniel gripped the driftwood tighter, bracing himself as each wave lifted him high, then dropped him back down. The ocean churned, and he felt himself drifting faster, carried by a stronger, more aggressive current. His heartbeat quickened. Where was it taking him? Out to deeper waters? Toward rocks? Toward nothing at all? The uncertainty gnawed at him, intensifying his fear. Then, in the distance, he spotted something, at first just a dark shape bobbing between swells. His heart surged with hope. Could it be another piece of debris? A boat? A buoy? He blinked, straining to see through the glare. When the object drifted closer, Daniel's hope twisted into unease. It wasn't a boat, and it wasn't debris. It was the carcass of a large fish, bloated, pale, and torn open along its side. The wound was deep, jagged, unmistakably made by something powerful. The fish had been attacked, possibly recently. The sight sent a shiver up his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. If something this large had been killed nearby, then whatever did it could easily be drawn to him. The thought was paralyzing. He watched the carcass drift past him, carried by the same current pulling him along. As it moved away, Daniel saw something else, shadows beneath the surface, faint but unmistakable, circling the remains. He closed his eyes, swallowing hard. He wasn't alone in these waters, and not everything out here was passive. The afternoon stretched on with torturous slowness. Daniel's skin burned from the sun, a cruel contrast to the freezing water that still soaked half his body. Despite the warmth above, the ocean below leached heat endlessly. His back ached. His legs felt stiff and foreign. Every muscle trembled with exhaustion. He tried shifting his position again just slightly to relieve the pressure on his chest, but the driftwood tilted dangerously. He backed off immediately, breathing hard. Even the smallest movement felt like a risk. His body begged for relief, for rest, for sleep, for anything, but the ocean allowed none of it. Survival meant suffering. There was no comfort in the sea, only endurance. As the sun began to lower toward the horizon, painting the sky with deep oranges and pinks, Daniel felt a surge of dread. The day had been brutal, but the night would be worse. If the cold had nearly taken him once already, what would happen during a second night adrift? He didn't have the strength he started with. He didn't have the mental clarity. His hands were numb, his lips blue, his limbs stiff. He imagined himself slipping beneath the surface, fading into the dark without even the strength to resist. The thought created a tightness in his chest. He couldn't afford panic, not now. He whispered to himself again, steady but strained. You survived once. You can survive again. He didn't fully believe the words, but speaking them kept the terror from consuming him. The sun dipped lower, almost touching the water. Daniel stared at it, feeling the fragile warmth fade from his skin. The colors of the sky blurred slightly, an early sign of exhaustion and dehydration tangled together. He tried to estimate how far he had drifted. 10 miles? 20? More? There was no way to know. The horizon was empty, silent, unchanging. He had never felt so untethered, so removed from the world he once knew. The sea felt like another planet, one that didn't recognize him, didn't care for him, didn't even acknowledge his existence. As the first hints of darkness crept across the surface, his heartbeat quickened again, a reminder of the long night ahead. By the time the sun finally disappeared, leaving a thin trail of fading color in the sky, Daniel felt the cold return, with a vengeance. The night breeze cut through him like a blade, stealing whatever warmth he had left from the day. The waves grew darker, shadows rising and falling around him. His hands trembled violently, his jaw clenched uncontrollably. He pressed his cheek to the driftwood and whispered a shaky prayer. Not for rescue, not yet. He prayed simply for strength. Strength to endure another night. Strength to stay awake, strength to hold on. The ocean swallowed the last traces of daylight, and with them, any remaining illusion of safety. Daniel exhaled slowly, bracing himself. The second night had begun. By the 19th hour, Daniel's world had shrunk to a trembling grip on the driftwood and the steady rhythm of waves smashing into his body. Time had become an enemy, slippery, distorted, impossible to grasp. His mind tried to count minutes, then abandoned the effort as exhaustion began carving deep trenches through his thoughts. The darkness around him seemed endless, a living thing that pressed against him, whispering doubts he tried not to entertain. Every instinct screamed for rest, for warmth, for safety, yet all he had was a fragile piece of floating wood and the flickering will to keep going. In moments like this, the human spirit doesn't roar. It flickers like a dying flame, desperate for anything to shield it from the wind. Cold seeped into Daniel's bones so deeply that he could no longer distinguish where his body ended and the ocean began. His fingers were numb, barely responsive, and his legs throbbed as if they had been replaced with blocks of ice. But the worst sensation was the creeping heaviness in his chest, a slow, suffocating weight that made every breath feel like he was inhaling fog instead of air. Hypothermia wasn't a concept to him anymore. It was a presence, a shadow that hovered just over his shoulder, waiting for the right moment to take him. His jaw chattered uncontrollably, sending sharp jolts through his skull, and each tremor reminded him that his strength was draining far faster than he anticipated. During brief moments of clarity, Daniel tried to focus on memories that warmed him from the inside. He thought of his mother's kitchen, the smell of bread in the oven, the low hum of a radio playing old hymns she loved. He remembered the way she smiled when he walked through the door, as if his presence alone restored peace to her day. He clung to those images, using them like lifelines to tether his consciousness. But even memories felt fragile now, slipping like sand between trembling fingers. Sometimes he questioned whether those memories were even real, or if his mind was conjuring illusions to distract him from the nightmare unfolding around him. When dawn finally began to break, it didn't bring relief, only dread. The faint blue glow on the horizon revealed how far he had drifted. There was no land, no boats, no birds, just the vast, endless ocean stretching into infinity. The sunlight didn't warm him. It exposed his hopelessness. In daylight, the truth was unavoidable. He was completely alone, suspended between life and death with nothing but water and silence to keep him company. His throat burned with thirst, and his lips were split, salty and swollen. When he tried to swallow, it felt like shards of glass scraping down his neck. He knew dehydration was setting in, slowly turning his body into a battlefield. That was when he began to see shapes in the water, shadows gliding beneath him in slow, deliberate patterns. At first he thought they were hallucinations born from fatigue, but the longer he stared, the more distinct they became. Dark silhouettes, long and fluid, moving with a predatory grace. He froze, barely daring to breathe. He couldn't tell how many there were or how close they were getting. The ocean held its secrets tightly, revealing only fragments to torment him. Daniel wasn't sure whether these creatures were curious or hungry, but either way, he knew he was vulnerable. The driftwood felt like nothing more than a thin shield against the unknown jaws circling beneath him. Panic clawed its way up his chest, but he forced himself to remain still. Sudden movements might attract unwanted attention. He remembered documentaries he had watched about marine life, the patterns of sharks, the behaviors of ocean predators, but his memory felt hazy and unreliable. Every ripple against his legs felt like a warning, every brush of seaweed transformed into imagined teeth. The isolation had begun to warp the line between real and unreal, and Daniel wasn't sure if he was losing his mind or finally seeing the ocean for what it truly was. a realm ruled by creatures that didn't care whether he lived or died. Eventually the shadows disappeared, leaving him deeply shaken. He released a long, trembling breath he didn't realize he had been holding. But the fear didn't fade. It lingered in his blood, making his heart beat in sharp, irregular pulses. He knew he couldn't withstand another confrontation like that. His emotional reserves were running dangerously low. In a single night, he had gone from confident fisherman to a man clinging to survival by the thinnest thread. The ocean had stripped him layer by layer until only raw humanity remained. And raw humanity, he realized, was fragile, terrifyingly fragile. As noon approached, the sun climbed high, turning the water into a shimmering silver mirror. The heat began to press against his skin, a stark contrast to the freezing night. It should have been comforting, but instead, it created a new torture. Dehydration intensified. His tongue felt swollen, thick, as if it barely fit in his mouth. The salty breeze stung his cracked lips. He tried to wet them, but with what? Every droplet around him was undrinkable. The more he thought about water, the thirstier he became. His body ached for relief that simply didn't exist. And the realization that he might die of thirst, surrounded by an ocean, carried a cruel irony that almost broke him. It was in this state of physical agony and mental fog that Daniel began to pray. Not the polished prayers he learned in church, not the structured sentences he spoke during holidays. These were raw, desperate pleas, broken fragments of hope whispered through chattering teeth. He asked for strength, for clarity, for the will to remain awake. He asked not for rescue, but for the endurance to hold on just a little longer. He didn't know if anyone heard him, didn't know if those prayers echoed into the heavens or simply dissolved into the salty air. But praying gave him something to focus on, something to hold on to when everything else was slipping away. By the end of the 24th hour, Daniel felt a shift, not in the ocean, but inside himself. He was terrified, exhausted and in pain, but he wasn't defeated. Somewhere deep within, beneath the layers of fear and doubt, a stubborn ember still burned. He didn't know how much longer he could endure, but he knew this. He wasn't ready to die. Not here. Not like this. And that small truth, fragile yet fierce, became his anchor. As the sun dipped once more and the sky began to darken, Daniel tightened his grip on the driftwood. Night was coming again, and with it new threats, new fears, and new battles. But he was still alive, and he would face whatever came next. As the second night crept in, Daniel felt its arrival like a shadow slipping over his shoulders. The fading light didn't just signal darkness, it signaled the start of another war. He remembered the previous night too vividly. The cold that gnawed at him, the creatures gliding beneath him, the terror that pressed on his lungs until breathing felt like swallowing ice. Now, as the sun bled into the horizon, he could feel his body tensing again, bracing for another long stretch of unbroken fear. The ocean around him shifted from a shimmering blue to an ominous black, swallowing shapes and distances until there was nothing left but sound. The slow, rhythmic sloshing of water against the driftwood he clung to. Daniel's body trembled involuntarily, his muscles contracting in small spasms he could no longer control. The warmth the sun had offered during the day had been temporary, shallow, barely enough to keep him from slipping into deeper hypothermia. Now, as the temperature dropped, every degree felt like a thief stealing the little strength he had left. His fingers were stiff, curled around the driftwood not out of intention, but because they no longer had the ability to release. His skin burned in some places and felt numb in others. A contradictory storm of sensations that made him wonder whether his body was shutting down or fighting back. The darkness deepened until Daniel couldn't distinguish the water from the sky. It all blended into a single suffocating void. His breaths formed small clouds of mist that vanished instantly, swallowed by the cold. The wind picked up, sharp and unforgiving, cutting through the soaked fabric of his clothes. He felt like a ghost drifting through an endless expanse. and that thought scared him more than the physical pain. He knew people could lose themselves mentally before their bodies gave out, and he feared that line was beginning to blur. His mind drifted in and out of focus, sometimes sharp, sometimes foggy, as if he were hovering on the edge of consciousness. It wasn't long before the ocean revealed its nighttime voice, deeper, heavier, almost alive. Waves began to rise in slow but growing swells, lifting and dropping Daniel with a force that shook his core. He clung tighter, biting down on his lip until he tasted blood. The movements were disorienting, sending nausea spiraling through his stomach. Each time a wave lifted him, he feared the driftwood would slip away. Each time it dropped him, he feared his strength wouldn't be enough to hold on. The sea had no intention of letting him rest. It wanted him alert, afraid, aware that survival was not a given. Hours passed. Daniel didn't know how many, only that the world around him had settled into a pattern of cold, fear, and drifting thoughts. It was then, in a moment of stillness between waves, that he heard something unusual. A faint tapping sound somewhere beneath him. At first he thought it was part of his imagination, another hallucination produced by exhaustion. But the sound came again, soft, rhythmic, foreign. His breath caught. The tapping grew louder, accompanied by a slow, shifting movement in the water. He lowered his head, listening, trying to decipher the source without moving too much. The ocean around him seemed to hold its breath. Then he felt it, a sudden brush against his leg, firm and deliberate. Not seaweed, not debris. Something alive, something large. Daniel's entire body tensed as adrenaline surged through him. He resisted the urge to kick, to thrash, to scream. Panic would only worsen things. He tried to steady his breathing, but it came out shallow and erratic. The creature circled slowly, its presence unmistakable in the movement of the water. Daniel couldn't tell what it was, shark, dolphin, or something else. But the uncertainty alone was enough to unravel him. In the dark, everything became a predator. Everything became a threat. Moments later, the water beneath him vibrated with a low, resonant hum. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears. It was one he felt in his bones. Whatever circled him was large, massive. The driftwood rocked gently as the creature glided past again, closer this time. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his chest, each pulse echoing in his ears. He clung to one truth. If the creature wanted to attack, it already would have. But that did little to comfort him. The ocean was vast, unpredictable, and governed by rules he couldn't understand. All he could do was endure, pray the creature would lose interest and drift away into the darkness. Eventually the water grew still again. The brushing stopped. The humming faded. The creature slipped away, leaving Daniel alone once more. Relief washed over him, but it was fragile, thin, hollow. He had survived another encounter, but his strength was dwindling. He felt dizzy, lightheaded, and unbearably tired. His eyes kept closing against his will, and each time they did, he jolted awake in terror, afraid he had let go of the driftwood. He needed to stay awake. He needed to keep his grip. But his body wasn't cooperating. Sleep, dangerous, seductive, kept calling to him. To fight the pull of unconsciousness, Daniel forced himself to think. He recited family names, childhood memories, anything that could keep his mind active. He thought of his brother, of the promise he once made that they would take a fishing trip together, something simple, normal, a plan that now felt painfully out of reach. He imagined his brother searching for him, refusing to give up. That image sparked a small ember of willpower inside him, a reminder that he wasn't ready to disappear into the ocean. Not tonight, not yet. By the time the sky began to lighten, the second night had carved deep scars into Daniel's soul. He was colder, weaker, more fragile than before. But he was alive. Barely, but still breathing. And that alone was a victory. The ocean had tried to break him again, but something within him refused to let go. As dawn approached, he lifted his head, searching the horizon for any sign of hope. Nothing. Only water. and distant streaks of pale morning light. But Daniel held on anyway, because now, after surviving 2 nights, he understood something vital. Sometimes survival isn't about strength, it's about refusing to surrender, even when the world around you demands it. By the start of the 43rd hour, Daniel felt like he was drifting between worlds, not fully alive, not yet gone, suspended in a place where time no longer behaved normally. His thoughts flickered like weak candle flames, unable to stay steady for long. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the salt into his skin until it felt like fire. The thirst was excruciating now, consuming every part of him. Each swallow sent sharp pain through his throat, and his tongue felt thick and swollen, barely able to move inside his mouth. His vision blurred at the edges, sometimes sharpening, sometimes dissolving into patches of white and blue. He had survived the cold of 2 nights, but now the sun was becoming a new kind of enemy, one that didn't attack violently, but quietly, relentlessly. His grip on the driftwood loosened several times without him noticing. Only when he felt himself sliding beneath the surface did instinct jolt him awake. He gasped and tightened his hold, blinking hard to regain focus. He was losing control over his body. His hands trembled violently, and his legs barely responded when he tried to move them. The ocean surrounding him felt heavier, thicker, as if it were slowly absorbing him into its depths. He fought against that sensation with what little strength he had left. Letting go meant sinking. Sinking meant silence. Silence meant the end. And although Daniel was exhausted beyond measure, something deep within him still resisted that ending. The hallucinations began subtly, strange lights flickering beneath the water, voices whispering indistinct words, just beyond reach. At first, Daniel dismissed them as tricks of the mind, but they grew more vivid, more insistent. He saw shapes forming in the sky, faces he recognized, gestures he longed to return to. At one point he thought he saw his brother standing on a boat, calling out to him, reaching for him. His heart leapt with hope so intense it hurt. But when he blinked, the image dissolved, leaving only the sea and the empty horizon. His chest tightened with heartbreak, but he forced himself to stay grounded in reality. Illusions were dangerous now. Hope needed to be anchored in truth, not fantasy. Still, not all hallucinations were cruel. Some carried memories that warmed him from within. He remembered sitting on a pier with his father, legs dangling over the edge, skipping stones across the water. He remembered laughter echoing through the house during family gatherings, the smell of grilled fish on summer evenings, the sound of waves hitting the shore during early mornings. These memories eased the fear gnawing at him, even when he questioned whether they were genuine or simply constructs of his fading mind. But authentic or not, they gave him the strength to keep floating, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. As midday approached, the water around him began to shift. The waves changed direction, rolling with a slow but deliberate pattern. Daniel felt it before he understood it, a pull, a subtle push beneath him. At first he thought it was another hallucination, but the current was real and growing stronger. The driftwood dipped and rose with each surge. His heart pounded as he tried to make sense of the change. Currents didn't shift at random. Something was influencing them. Whether it was weather, nearby land, or an unseen underwater formation, he didn't know. But the change meant movement, and movement meant possibility. He forced himself to lift his head, squinting through the sunlight to scan the horizon. His eyes burned from the salt, but he kept searching, slowly, methodically. At first he saw nothing, just shimmering water merging with sky. But then, after several agonizing seconds, he noticed it. A faint line. A shape that didn't belong to the sea. His heart stuttered. He blinked, rubbed his eyes with the back of his arm, looked again. It was there. Solid, faint, distant, but undeniably real. Land. The realization hit him like a surge of electricity. He wasn't drifting aimlessly anymore. The current was pulling him somewhere. That spark of hope stirred something powerful inside him. but it also triggered a wave of fear. Hope was dangerous. Hope could break a man faster than despair if things went wrong. What if the land was too far? What if he didn't have the strength to hold on until he reached it? What if the current changed again and carried him away? Doubt pressed against him, heavy and suffocating. His body was failing. He could feel it in the slow, unsteady beats of his heart, in the fog rolling through his mind. But even through the fear, the land remained visible. A reminder that this nightmare might have an end. Daniel tried to adjust his body, angling the driftwood so the current could carry him faster. It took every ounce of strength he had. His arms trembled violently, and his vision darkened at the edges. Several times he felt himself slipping toward unconsciousness, but each time he forced his eyes open, gasping and shaking. His survival depended on staying awake, on fighting every instinct that begged for rest. He whispered to himself, muttering words he couldn't fully understand, sometimes prayers, sometimes memories, sometimes just the sound of his own name to remind himself who he was. Anything to stay tethered to life. As he inched closer to the faint line of land, shapes began to form. Clusters of trees, a stretch of beach, rocky outcroppings. It was still far, but no longer unimaginable. Waves pushed him forward slowly but steadily. For the first time in nearly 2 days, the ocean felt like it wasn't trying to kill him. The closer he drifted, the more his emotions swelled. Relief, fear, disbelief, gratitude. Every feeling collided at once, overwhelming him. Tears welled in his eyes without him realizing, mixing with the salt water on his face. He wasn't safe yet, but he was close. Close enough that survival was no longer a distant dream, but something within reach. When the driftwood finally scraped against sand, the shock of contact jolted Daniel's entire body. He tried to move but collapsed, his limbs refusing to support him. He clawed at the wet sand, dragging himself forward with slow, pitiful movements. Every inch felt like a battle, every breath felt like a victory. He didn't stop until the waves could no longer pull him back. Then, he collapsed fully, face against the warm shore, trembling from exhaustion. He had made it. 48 hours in the grasp of an unforgiving ocean, and he had survived. The world around him blurred, the sounds grew distant, and his consciousness slipped away, but not into death, into rest, into relief, into freedom. When Daniel awoke hours later, lying in a small clinic near the shoreline where he had been found, he felt the weight of the past 48 hours settle over him like a blanket made of both terror and grace. His body ached in ways he never thought possible. Muscles stiff, skin burned, lips cracked, throat raw. But he was alive. That realization hit him with overwhelming force. He wasn't meant to survive what he endured. The ocean had pushed him to the brink, stripping him down to the most vulnerable parts of himself. But somehow, through a mixture of instinct, faith, and a fragile thread of hope, he had endured. Doctors told him that minutes more in the water could have meant a different ending. He listened quietly, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment he clung to that driftwood, while darkness and fear circled him like vultures. He knew he hadn't escaped by strength alone. There had been something greater carrying him through the impossible. As he recovered, Daniel found himself reflecting not on the terror he faced, but on the clarity it had forced upon him. When a man is left alone with nothing but the vast ocean and his own heartbeat, he confronts truths he never dared to speak aloud. Daniel realized how much of his life he had taken for granted. The sound of laughter, the warmth of sunlight on dry land, the comfort of a familiar face close by. He promised himself he would no longer rush through life as though it were endless. The ocean, in all its cold indifference, had shown him the fragility of existence and the preciousness of every breath. Prayer had become his anchor in those darkest hours, and now, even back on solid ground, that connection felt stronger than ever. He understood now that survival wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. It was the decision to hold on to hope, even when everything in the world tries to steal it from you. When Daniel finally stepped outside days later, walking slowly onto the same beach that had saved his life, he felt the warm sand beneath his feet and breathed in the salty air with a reverence he never knew before. The ocean stretched out before him, vast, majestic, and dangerous, and yet he didn't feel anger or fear. He felt gratitude. Not for the suffering he endured, but for the transformation it brought. He had seen the ocean's darkness, but he had also seen what resilience looks like when a human soul refuses to surrender. Daniel knew that his story would remain with him forever, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a testament to the power of endurance, faith, and the quiet miracles that carry us through the storms we never expect. And as he watched the waves roll in and out, he whispered a simple truth to himself, one he had earned the right to believe. I survived, and I am alive for a reason.